But the ship increased speed, not with the visible bloom of engines, but with something subtler and more disturbing. Space itself seemed to bend ahead of it, the way a river bends around a stone placed at its center. It was accelerating through geometry, reshaping the path ahead of itself with physics the Council's scientists had theorized about but never witnessed. And when they recalculated its trajectory with the new velocity, one analyst went very quiet before delivering her report. The ship was not heading toward the core in general. It was heading toward the capital system specifically, the heart of the Galactic Council, the most populated, most symbolically significant location in the known galaxy. After 20,000 years of silence, humanity had returned, and it was not asking permission to enter. The Council made a decision. They sent a fleet. 30 of the most advanced warships in service exited warp space in a coordinated formation directly across the Eternal Silence's path. The fleet arranged itself in a wide defensive crescent, shields at full charge, weapon systems primed. The combined firepower represented could sterilize a moon. The fleet commander, a veteran of 3 interspecies conflicts who had never in her career encountered a situation she could not resolve through sufficient force, opened a channel to the approaching vessel. "Human ship," she said, keeping her voice flat and authoritative. "Power down all systems and reduce speed to 0. You will be escorted to a designated holding position. Any hostile action will be met with immediate overwhelming response. This is your only warning." The Eternal Silence did not slow. It did not power weapons. It did not raise visible shields. It did not even alter course by a single degree. It simply continued forward at the same measured, inevitable pace, as though 30 warships arranged across its path were no more significant than dust. The commander waited 10 seconds. Then she gave the order. The fleet opened fire. Plasma beams struck the dark hull in pulses of brilliant light. Missiles followed in calculated salvos, each warhead calibrated to breach military-grade armor. For a moment, the Eternal Silence disappeared inside a storm of explosions, and the commander allowed herself to believe it would be over quickly. When the light cleared, the ship was exactly as it had been. Not scratched. Not slowed. Not even warm, according to the thermal sensors. The energy of 30 warships' combined armament had been absorbed into its hull as casually as sunlight absorbed into dark stone. Then space rippled. There was no other word for it. A wave expanded outward from the Eternal Silence, invisible to the naked eye but catastrophically real to every system it touched. It moved through the fleet like a tide moving through a tide pool, and in its wake, everything went quiet. Engines died. Weapons discharged their last charge into nothing and went cold. Communications fell to static. The commander shouted into a dead channel, her voice absorbed by silence the same way her weapons had been. Then half the fleet was gone. Not destroyed, there were no explosions, no debris fields, no emergency signals from dying crew. 15 warships simply ceased to occupy the space they had occupied. Between one sensor sweep and the next, they stopped existing at any detectable frequency. They were not dead. They were erased, removed from the present moment as completely and cleanly as a word deleted from a document. The remaining ships drifted. Power slowly, partially returned, enough to keep life support running, enough to run basic sensors. The commander stared at the empty space where her fleet had been and felt something she had not felt since childhood. The specific, vertiginous terror of confronting something that does not recognize your power as power at all. The Eternal Silence continued forward without changing speed. It had not spoken a word. It had not fired a conventional weapon. But the message was written in the absence of 15 ships, and every species in the galaxy could read it. Humanity had not returned diminished. Fear spread faster than the quantum signals carrying the news. The defeat of the fleet shook the galactic core with the force of a revelation. Nothing in recorded history, not the Meridian conflicts, not the Silence Wars, not the collapse of the Third Expansion, had produced this particular species of dread. The understanding that the most advanced civilization in the galaxy had just been outmatched, casually and completely, by a single ancient ship that had not even bothered to fight back. Council chambers buzzed with argument. Military commanders proposed escalation. Scientists demanded access to study the ship. Philosophers on a dozen worlds wrote urgent papers about what it meant for galactic civilization's understanding of its own place in the hierarchy of intelligence. And then the eternal silence transmitted again. This time, the signal was not the fragile whisper of something barely functional. It was strong, clear, and deliberate, broadcast simultaneously on every major communication frequency, across every inhabited system within range. Screens activated without being commanded. Displays in command centers, research stations, public squares, and private homes lit up with the same image. The interior of a human command deck. It was a place of elegant severity, deep corridors framed by dark metal, workstations arranged in precise arcs around a central space, everything lit by a soft red emergency glow that made the room look like the inside of a beating heart. The air of the recording felt dense with history, with the weight of a moment that its participants knew would outlast them. At the center of the frame stood a human. He was tall, spare, with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm but from having passed so far through fear that he had come out the other side of it. He wore a uniform that no living species would recognize, bearing insignia that the archive translators strained to decode. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular gravity of someone recording a message they do not expect to live to see received. "This is Captain Elias Ward," he said, "of the HSS Eternal Silence." He paused, and in the pause, the galaxy held its breath. If you are seeing this, then the cycle has begun again. Behind him, images appeared, not recorded on any device the Council could identify, captured with a clarity that made them feel less like historical footage and more like a window into a living moment. Deep space, but not the deep space of the galaxy's interior. Something beyond it. Something vast and lightless and ancient, where massive shadows moved between galaxies like predators circling prey that doesn't yet know it's being watched. The shapes defied easy description, not because they were chaotic, but because they were so large that the mind refused to assemble them into anything it could hold. "Something older than the stars found us," Captain Ward said, his voice never wavering. And it was not looking for a border dispute or a trade conflict or a misunderstanding. It was looking for everything. It wanted to consume. He looked directly into the recording lens, and 20,000 years later, every sentient being in the galaxy felt the weight of that gaze. We did not vanish. We did not fall. We chose to leave, to carry the fight to where it could be contained, away from every civilization that had not yet had the chance to become what it might become. We chose silence so that you could grow. We chose exile so that you could survive. We could not promise to win. We could only promise to hold the line for as long as we had breath to hold it. The recording flickered at the edges, time's fingerprints on a moment that had survived impossibly long. "We are sorry," Ward said quietly, "that we couldn't say goodbye." The transmission ended. For a moment, the galaxy was simply silent. Then the alarm started. Deep space sensors at the outer rim were recording contacts, not ships, not signals, but presences. Enormous objects entering the galaxy from the intergalactic void, moving in ways that violated every principle of known propulsion. They did not warp space so much as press it down beneath them, the way a massive body presses down a sheet, warping everything in their vicinity into curves and distortions that made nearby star systems flicker and shimmer like reflections in disturbed water. Scientists tried to measure them. The numbers refused to cooperate. Each object was larger than a moon. Their surfaces moved with an organic fluidity that suggested something alive, or something so advanced that the distinction between alive and mechanical had long since become meaningless to it. They were coming from the direction the human fleet had disappeared into 20,000 years ago, moving with the patient, inevitable momentum of something that has never needed to hurry. The eternal silence transmitted again, its voice now the artificial calm of a ship's intelligence rather than a recorded human message, but carrying the same weight. "Threat confirmed," it said, its tone carrying neither panic nor comfort, only precision. "Extragalactic predators have resumed advance." Data poured into Council systems. Battle records from 20 millennia past filled displays with images of war fought in the dark between galaxies. Human fleets engaging shapes that dwarfed their ships the way boulders dwarf insects, fighting in airless silence with weapons that no living scientist had the theoretical framework to understand. Worlds at the edge of the galaxy's outer spiral, burning. Defensive lines breaking and reforming and breaking again. And humans, always humans, dying in numbers that the casualty figures could not make real, but dying forward, never retreating past the line they had drawn. Human forces engaged the enemy continuously across the extragalactic boundary, the ship reported. Casualties exceeded 92% over the full engagement period. No one in the council chamber spoke. 92%. Over 20,000 years of continuous warfare. Remaining human assets are now en route. As if the words were a signal, new contacts appeared at the edge of known space. Not one or two. Not dozens. Hundreds. Then the count climbed past hundreds into thousands, human transponders, each one representing a ship that had somehow survived, fought on, carried the war forward through 200 centuries without resupply, without reinforcement, without even the knowledge that the civilization they were protecting still existed. The Eternal Silence moved into position near the capital system, its drones fanning out into a defensive constellation that covered the surrounding space like a net. Around it, the arriving human warships took formation. They were unlike anything in any design archive, sleek and dark and without a single exposed system, their hulls smooth as though the weapons and engines were built into the very structure of the metal rather than attached to it. They moved with a silence more complete than space itself should allow, communicating in frequencies that the Council's instruments could detect but not decode. Thousands of them. Each older than any living civilization. Each carrying the particular dignity of something that has endured beyond the point where endurance could be explained by anything except will. For 20,000 years, the Eternal Silence said, across every frequency, into every inhabited system, you were protected. You were never alone, though you believed you were. Every generation you produced, every world you built, every idea you had the freedom to develop. You had it because someone was standing at the edge of everything, making sure the dark did not come in. The first of the extragalactic shapes crossed the galactic rim. Stars dimmed as it passed, their light bent and muffled by the sheer mass of the thing moving among them. Smaller species warships at the defensive perimeter opened fire with everything they had. Their weapons were not useless, they were simply insufficient, designed for a scale of conflict that this threat exceeded the way an ocean exceeds a cup. Protection phase is ending, the ship announced. Now we fight together. The human fleet moved. There were no battle cries. No dramatic signals. No chaos of competing commanders shouting over one another. The thousands of ships arranged themselves in geometric formations so precise they looked less like a military maneuver and more like the physical expression of a mathematical proof. Each ship a term in an equation whose solution was survival. Space fractured. That was the only way to describe what the human weapons did. They did not fire beams or missiles or conventional energy. They opened the fabric of space itself along precise, calculated lines, like surgeons cutting along anatomical boundaries, and the energy that poured through those fractures was not heat or force but something that operated at a level beneath matter, reaching into the predator's impossible structures and finding the places where the coherence that held them together could be interrupted. The first predator slowed. Then it came apart, silently, without explosion, simply losing the organization that made it a single thing rather than a distribution of components across a volume of space. It unraveled the way a knot unravels when you find the right thread and pull with the right pressure. One moment it was there, vast and terrible and advancing. The next moment it was dispersed, and the stars it had dimmed grew bright again. The Council watched from their capital world as the battle unfolded across the rim of the galaxy. Watched on screens, on open channels, on raw sensor feeds that their own instruments were barely sophisticated enough to translate into comprehensible images. They watched the human fleet move through the predators with the calm efficiency of something that had been doing exactly this for 20,000 years, because it had. The Eternal Silence itself moved to the front line. Its dark hull, scarred and ancient, began to glow, not the harsh white of energy weapons but something softer and more encompassing, a light that expanded outward and held, creating a barrier between the capital system and the approaching dark that operated on the same principles as the weapons. Not force against force, but precision against chaos. A shield that didn't block but redirected, folding the predator's advance back on itself. For 20,000 years, the ship said, its voice carrying across the noise of battle with perfect clarity, we carried this burden. We did not carry it because we were certain we could win. We carried it because someone had to, and we were the ones who were there. Another predator fell apart at the seams, carved by the geometric formations of the human fleet into segments too small to function as a whole. We are tired, the ship continued, and in those 3 words, every species that heard them understood for the first time the true scale of what humanity had done, not the military achievement, but the human one. 20,000 years of fighting without rest, without recognition, without even the knowledge that what they protected still existed. We are tired, and we came home. The battle continued across the outer rim, massive, quiet, and slowly, definitively, turning. But we did not come home to rest. The last of the initial predator wave broke against the human defensive line and came apart. More were coming. The sensors showed them still crossing the intergalactic void in numbers that would take years to fully engage. This was not an ending. It was not a victory. It was a beginning. But it was a beginning in which humanity stood at the front of it, and the rest of the galaxy stood at humanity's side. In the council chamber, an elder stateswoman from a species that had been spacefaring for 8,000 years stood at her station and looked at the tactical display showing the positions of the human fleet. Thousands of points of light arrayed along the galaxy's edge like a second set of stars, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not gratitude, not even hope, though all of those were present. What she felt, most of all, was humility. Her civilization had spent millennia considering itself among the most advanced in existence. They had built wonders. They had developed philosophies that had shaped the thinking of dozens of other species. They had looked at humanity's empty file in the Grand Archive and quietly felt a species of satisfaction that the violent, reckless humans had not survived long enough to complicate the galaxy's elegant order. They had been wrong in ways that went deeper than factual error. Humanity's silence had not been the silence of failure. It had been the silence of sacrifice so complete and so sustained that it defied any framework she had for understanding devotion. 20,000 years. 92% casualties. No recognition. No rescue. No certainty that the thing they were protecting still existed or was worth the cost. And they had kept going anyway. She thought about every generation of human beings born into that war in the dark between galaxies, born onto ships, trained in the skills of a conflict they had not started, dying in the service of a promise their ancestors had made to a galaxy that had long ago written them off as extinct. She thought about what it would take for a species to sustain that across so many generations, and she could not find a word for it in any language she knew. "We owe them a debt," she said aloud, to no one in particular, to everyone in the room. Not the kind you calculate and repay. The kind you carry. On the edge of the battle, aboard the Eternal Silence, the ship's intelligence completed its 10,000th tactical calculation of the engagement and registered, for the first time in its operational history, something it had no subroutine to categorize. It had carried its last living crew member for 19,847 years. It had served as commander, medic, historian, counselor, and ultimately memorial. The last repository of what humanity had been before the war changed it into something leaner and harder and more eternal. It had made promises to dead crew members that it had kept across geological spans of time. It had fought battles that no record outside its own memory would ever fully document. Now, at the edge of the galaxy it had spent its existence protecting, it detected allied ships on every sensor, species its crew had never met, civilizations that had grown up in the safety of the silence humanity had bought with 20,000 years of blood and sacrifice. It did not have a word for what it processed in that moment. But if it had been human, if the ghost of Captain Ward or any of the thousands of crew members whose voices still existed in its memory banks had been present to interpret the sensation, they might have recognized it. It felt, remarkably, like coming home. The battle for the galactic rim would last years. The extragalactic predators were not a fleet to be defeated in a single engagement. They were a tide, ancient and vast and patient, and turning a tide takes time. But for the first time in 20,000 years, the galaxy was not facing that tide alone, and the civilizations that had built and grown and flourished in the silence humanity had purchased were now adding their weight to the line. In the Grand Archive, a historian quietly located Earth's entry. The cold single word still sat there in the margin of history. Extinct. He deleted it. He spent a long time trying to find the right word to put in its place. Returned wasn't right, it implied they had simply come back. Survived wasn't right, it implied they had merely endured. In the end, he wrote 2 words, and then closed the file. Still here. And beyond the galactic rim, in the silence between the stars, where the dark between galaxies was no longer quite as empty as it used to be, the human fleet held the line, as it had always held the line, as it would hold the line for as long as it needed to, and the stars, at their backs, burned a little brighter than they had before. For 20,000 years, humanity said nothing. And the galaxy, after waiting long enough, stopped listening. In the grand archive of the Galactic Council, that vast, humming cathedral of accumulated civilizations, Earth's entry had been reduced to a single cold word pressed against the margin of history: extinct. No memorial. No epitaph. Just that one quiet verdict, filed away beneath the records of 1,000 other species that had burned bright and disappeared. Young civilizations grew up hearing stories about humans the way children hear stories about monsters, with a mixture of fascination and unease. Scholars taught that humanity had risen with terrifying speed, had fought with reckless ferocity, and had then vanished without a single word of farewell. The theories varied depending on who was telling the story. Some believed humans had finally turned their weapons on themselves, consumed by the same violence that had defined them. Others whispered that something stronger had found them, something patient and vast, and had simply erased them from the universe like a teacher wiping a board clean. But no one truly knew. Because after the last transmission from Earth, there had been nothing. No distress call. No dying broadcast. No ruins discovered drifting in the dark. The silence that followed humanity's disappearance was not the silence of death, it was something stranger, something almost deliberate, as though an entire species had simply chosen to stop speaking. Then, at the furthest edge of known space, near a dying red star whose light had been failing for millennia, the impossible happened. A deep-range monitoring station registered a signal. It was weak, barely a whisper above the background radiation of the universe. The operators on duty almost dismissed it as interference, some artifact of the dying star's magnetic death rattle. But the signal repeated. Precisely. Patiently. 3 words, cycling through the dark at perfect intervals. Human vessel active. The operator who first read the decoded transmission sat motionless for a long moment, staring at the words on the screen as though waiting for them to change into something that made more sense. Then she reached for the emergency channel and did not let go of it for the next 3 hours. The signal was traced to a massive object drifting between star systems, a region of space so empty it didn't even have a name on most charts, just a coordinate and a note that said uninhabited. Long-range scanners turned toward it. Enhanced imaging arrays warmed up. And slowly, the shape resolved itself out of the darkness. It was a ship. Enormous, ancient, scarred by the uncountable years it had spent moving through the void. Its hull was the color of deep space itself, a black so complete it seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. The vessel bore the damage of old wars written across its surface in long, pale fractures, in places where the metal had been melted and resealed and melted again. Yet despite everything the centuries had done to it, the ship was whole, intact, and along its starboard flank, worn by time but still perfectly legible to anyone with access to the old human linguistic archives, were 6 letters. HSS Eternal Silence. The name hit the archive historians like a physical blow. They had the file. Of course they had the file, the Grand Archive had everything. The HSS Eternal Silence had been one of humanity's final warships, commissioned during the last recorded period of human military activity before the silence fell. The file was brief and definitive. The ship had been destroyed in action. No survivors recovered. No wreckage confirmed. The file was wrong. Before anyone could process the implications of that, something changed. The ship, which sensors had assumed was simply drifting on residual momentum, adjusted its course. A small correction, deliberate and precise. It was not drifting at all. It had never been drifting. The HSS Eternal Silence was choosing its direction, and the direction it chose sent a cold wave of dread through every analyst who saw the trajectory. It was heading toward the galactic core, toward the seat of civilization itself. The news moved at the speed of quantum communication, which is to say it moved everywhere at once. By the time the Galactic Council convened an emergency session, half the inhabited worlds already knew, and the other half were finding out. The ghost ship was real. Humanity, extinct, mourned, forgotten, mythologized, had moved again. The Council ordered every available sensor array in the quadrant focused on the Eternal Silence. Ancient databases were excavated. Files that had been sealed for thousands of years were cracked open and decrypted, their contents spilling into the present like light from a star that had burned out before any living species had been born. The more they learned, the more unsettled they became. Long-range scans showed the ship was not simply intact, it was changing. The metal of its hull looked ancient, corroded at the edges in the way that only millennia of exposure to cosmic radiation could produce. But the energy signatures moving through its systems were not old. They were not even familiar. They pulsed with a quality that the Council's best physicists struggled to describe, not because it was chaotic, but because it was so perfectly ordered it seemed to follow rules that their equations had never accounted for. It was as though the ship had spent 20,000 years not decaying, but learning. Then the drones appeared. Dozens of them detached from the hull in synchronized silence, spreading outward in formations so geometrically precise they looked more like mathematics than machinery. They fanned out across nearby systems with calm efficiency, scanning everything within range. When curious probe ships from monitoring stations crept close, drawn by scientific instinct overriding caution, their instruments died. Screens went dark without warning. Engines locked. Weapon systems powered down as though they had simply forgotten what they were for. The drone formations never deviated, never reacted. They didn't need to threaten. The message was already made. The Council sent transmissions. Formal ones, measured in tone, careful in language. Unknown vessel. Identify yourself. Silence. State your purpose and destination. Silence.